Okay, so this is Harvesting Infinity, episode 6, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about where did this come from and what is this program about? But before I tell you, I'm going to play a little bit and maybe you'll be able to connect the dots. I say open your eyes and look all around you. There's plenty of things to be seen, plenty of things happening about you. Don't you see what they mean? Don't waste your time on sitting and waiting for something to happen to you. Just get yourself moving and see what you can do. Well, open your eyes and look all around you. There's plenty of things to be seen, plenty of things happening about you. Don't you see what I mean? And don't waste your time on sitting and waiting for something to happen to you. Just get yourself moving and see what you can do. Life's an improvisation. Open your eyes. So what does this have to do with Harvesting Infinity? Well, what this is all about is creative outliers. I'm making the assumption that the audience for this show is not necessarily regular, normal people, but creative outliers. Even if only 1 out of 100 people is a creative outlier, that's still 80 million on the planet. So it's not exactly a small audience. And this show is kind of the outcome of a 50-year-long arc. I spent 25 years as an innovator in a bunch of world-class innovation centers like Bose and Apple and DARPA and the National Science Foundation. And then I spent another 25 years helping innovators to innovate. And after 50 years of being involved in innovation and hanging out with innovators and being part of innovation relationships, it occurred to me that society still has no idea what to do with creative people. And they really desperately need to know what to do with creative people because it's creative people who create tomorrow. And if you don't like the way things are today, and you're resistant to the change that's going to come about tomorrow, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So that's why this program is called Harvesting Infinity. Harvesting Infinity is what innovators do. It's not necessarily what creative outliers do. My simplest definition of what is innovation is adopted insight. If there isn't some insight, some new thought, some new awareness, it's not innovation. And if it doesn't get adopted by anybody, it's also not innovation. Creative outliers have plenty of insights, but it's really, really difficult to get them adopted because most of the world is afraid of change. There's ripples through our political systems. People are very resistant to change because things won't be the way they used to be. And that is scary to a lot of people, which makes it very difficult to become an innovator. You have to be pretty stubborn and pretty resilient. So my whole goal with this program and my columns and my books and the other things I write and the speeches I give around the world is to help creative outliers become innovators, because the human race needs innovation really badly to solve its problems. And it's resistant to solving its problems, as you might notice from our current election cycle. There are a lot of people who would prefer to go back to the past, even though it's impossible because we don't have any time machines. You can't go back to the past, no matter how badly you want to or think that you could. It's just not an option. Once a thought has been thought, it can't be unthought. Once you have seen something, like a debate, you can't unsee it. And once you have heard something, you can't unhear it. So there's really no choice. It's either go forward or get in trouble. And that's what this program is about. So just to expand a little bit about some of the situations that I found myself in having to overcome this resistance. All of the people that have been interviewed and conversed with on this program have been innovators. They were all creative outliers who didn't follow the mainstream, and they somehow created new things. Today's episode has two. Nina Colosi has founded the Streaming Museum, which is a international cross-cultural arts streaming museum. A couple of weeks ago, she did something in Lincoln Center. She does things in Russia, Europe, the EU. She just created a streaming museum. That's really being an innovator. And the other segment today is with David Jameson, who was a musician and toured for 4 or 5 years and decided he better go back to college and do something. And he didn't just do something. He actually spent another 10 years in college. He got a PhD in computer science and came out and worked for IBM in their research lab, where he convinced them to start a music department. And then he started creating software for musicians. So like me, he was a music guy who became a tech guy, probably for the same reasons. It's a lot easier to afford to buy a house if you're a tech guy than if you're a music guy. But then we ended up back in music as well. Nina, our other guest today, she was a pianist who had really wanted to be a dancer, but then ended up becoming a composer, and somehow or another became the curator of a bunch of art exhibits and ended up flying around the world introducing people to digital arts. So they were definitely innovators. They started as creative outliers, as I did, and all three of us seem to have had the support of parents who thought it was okay for us to do our own thing. Not everybody has parents that think it's okay for them to do their own thing. It's one of the difficulties of going from being a creator to an innovator. You really need support. So if the people around you think it's a really terrible idea for you to come up with new ideas, it's a lot harder. So I want to give you a couple of examples of this. So I was at Bose Corporation from 1980 to 90, and it was a completely analog company. No digital, nothing. And they didn't think they needed digital anything. It took me roughly a decade to convince them that digital audio might be something that was happening. Now it's ubiquitous. Now the whole world is digital audio. Bose didn't want to do it. And I had to basically arm wrestle each of the 60 engineers one at a time to prove to them that digital might be worth doing. We did all of our measurements in those days with oscilloscopes and chart recorders and beat frequency oscillators and XY plotters. And I had to take people on one at a time and say, okay, I'll measure it digitally. You do it your way, and we'll see who can get it done first or better. It took a decade and 60 of these different interactions. Eventually, I convinced the engineers that digital was useful for measurements, but they still weren't convinced that it was useful for listening to, because at the time computers were very expensive. And to replace the equalizer in the Bose 901 took me $100,000 worth of digital hardware. And even though the equalizer took about $120 worth of parts, it didn't cost $120,000, it cost $120. It took Moore's Law a few more decades to get to the point where equalizers were cost effective. So although this sounds so simple, go to a world-class audio company full of lots of smart people, show them, hey, let's do digital stuff. Not so easy. It still took 10 years anyway. And you'd think that it would have been obvious when we first did it, but it wasn't, even though it eventually became a $1 billion division of doing digital audio. And even though we began to sell our measurement system to other companies, because it turned out digital was really, really powerful. But I can't tell you how many times I got yelled at for doing digital. The analog world did not want to do digital audio at all. That's one example. The next example is after they got done yelling at me for doing digital, I said, well, why don't we put Bose sound systems in Apple computers? Don't you think computers should have speakers and microphones? And they said, no. Computers aren't for entertainment. Computers are for solving problems. That one also took a really long time. Eventually, I got hired by Apple, and I convinced them that every single computer should have a speaker and a microphone. And we built prototypes of monitors with built-in speakers and microphones, which never shipped as products. And we cut holes in laptops to put in speakers and microphones, which was tough because they're small. And we had to invent something called microacoustics, because there weren't any speakers and microphones that were tiny enough to put in a laptop that sounded any good. So although it was a very simple idea, hey, let's put high-quality audio in a computer, that too took a lot of years. It's a $1 billion market, at least now. If you count the whole entertainment market, it's a $1 trillion market, and it's one of the reasons that Apple became the most valuable company on the face of the earth, because they started to understand that emotions mattered, not just intellect. But just these two simple projects, took almost 20 years of my life. This is not atypical. Innovators end up spending a lot of time. And I was fortunate, because Apple was ahead of the rest of the world in computers, and Bose was ahead of the rest of the world in audio. So even with smart people who are progressive, in innovation culture, where they respect and they value creativity, it still took a really long time. Had I tried to do this on an IBM PC or on an Android, well, by then Androids were imitating iPhones. Imitation only takes a couple of years. When I would visit friends at JBL who are engineers and say, what are you guys working on? They go, oh, we're doing what Bose did 2-3 years ago because we're just imitating you. Management didn't really want them to innovate because it was risky. This is why very conservative people don't want to change governments and programs, because they might not be in power anymore. And it's very upsetting to somebody who's in power to not be in power. This is why people resist change. They're afraid they might lose something. Now, the only time people really change is when things are really messed up. So, for example, in the United States, this is 2024, we're going through an election cycle. Things finally got messed up enough that change was demanded, and it's happening now. But it took so much frustration with the way things were for people to consider the risk of doing something differently. So this is the first lesson. If you are a creative outlier and you have great insights and great ideas, and you want to become an innovator and get people to try your ideas out and adapt them and adopt them, it's going to take a while, and you're going to have to be thick-skinned. And all of the, so far 12 people I've interviewed for this show, Harvesting Infinity, did have something in common. They didn't listen when they were told, you can't do that. They just didn't listen. Whether they were secure enough or stubborn enough, or their parents made them feel safe enough. It was all different combinations of things, but one thing was in common. None of them did what the world expected them to do. They did their own thing. And it could be a little bit lonely if you're going to try to be a creative person who does your own thing, because you're going to be misunderstood a lot. So unless you're capable of making yourself feel okay or creating your own personal meaning by doing creative things, that's why one of the segments is called Meaning Place, it's going to be really tough. And a lot of creative outliers never become innovators because they get worn down by all of the resistance and the opposition. So that's the first thing. Some of these people were born into families where their parents were very creative and very innovative, so they would have been hypocritical to tell their kids not to innovate. Instead, they told us to innovate, but to make sure we could earn a living also. So although they did not tell us we should not innovate, they said make sure you also get some other skills so that you can actually pay your bills. So that's why many of us had more than one career and more than one life. And I know very many musical people when they were younger who ended up doing other things. And then when they became old like me, got back to being a musician again. But I'm 71, and my parents are no longer around to tell me that I can't do this. This is what Harvesting Infinity is about. You don't have to wait until your parents go to do it. There are many things that you could learn, which is why I give lectures and write books and do a blog posting every day and have columns in the Berkshire Edge. This program is an extension of all those activities. Everything I've been doing for the last 50 years is all the same thing. It's all about how do you innovate? How do you make it easier? What makes it more likely that your ideas will be adopted? It's just that now we have a lot more ways to transmit information. And it still doesn't happen until people don't want it to be the way that it used to be. When they give up on the present and say, well, I guess we're willing to take a chance. So at the moment, I think we may be facing something like the Renaissance. The last time the whole world decided to go backwards in time, we had something called the Dark Ages for 1,000 years. And then in Florence, in Italy, there was a Renaissance, a rebirth, where the innovators got a chance to go out and make things happen. Now, we don't need to go through 1,000 years of Dark Ages, because we already did that. It's in the history books. And at the moment, there is a battle between autocracy, which is the concentrating of power and the denying of the freedom to create, and progressive free structures, which encourage innovation. And it still remains to be seen what's going to happen. There's going to be an election pretty soon. But I think I still have about another minute and a half. So I think maybe I'll play another piece of music to play this segment out. This one's called Lost Mind. And theoretically, it's supposed to be about romance, but it could be about ideas too. So here we go. A little more volume. Well, if you could be so kind to help me find my mind, I'd like to thank you in advance. Know this before we start. My soul's been torn apart. I lost my mind in wild romance. My future is my past. These memories will last. I'd like to live the love of days gone by. Each day that comes and goes is like the one before. I lost my mind the day I died. Words would fail me if I tried to describe her, though I know she's not all she should have been. This is an idea, not just a person. She was a devil with the face of an angel. She was sweet and cruel, cruel and sweet as homemade sin. So if you could be so kind to help me find my mind. Innovators have this a lot. I'd like to thank you in advance. Know this before we start. My soul's been torn apart. I lost my mind in wild romance. I lost my mind in wild romance. Lost Mind by Mose Allison. So this is Harvesting Infinity, episode 6, and we're going to have a conversation with two tech guys who are really music guys, pretending that they're tech guys, but then we became tech guys, but now we're back to being music guys who still do tech. I worked at Apple. David worked at IBM. So we could talk about that for a pretty long time, but there are more interesting things to talk about, like how abstract do you have to be a musician versus a research person? Or, I see we're on this one now. Anyway, I think we can pick any non-convergent topic we want. How about let's start with levels of conceptual abstraction, since I think most of the world isn't, and we are. So did it make it hard for you to fit into the world being an abstract kind of guy?
It did for a while growing up, because I was thinking about things that most of my friends were not thinking about. And I was always interested in bigger picture type events that were going on. So I remember one friend of mine, we were talking about something, and he would talk about, the Earth, and I would talk about the planets. I was sort of like at the next level, the Earth isn't the whole thing, it's just one. And so I got very interested in, you go up the scale and you understand things at different levels of there.
So you were always meta?
Pretty much. I got interested in, if you're trying to understand something, and you can have a debate about what does it even mean to understand, you have to abstract, because otherwise you have to do everything, understanding with quarks, or whatever's underneath quarks. So you have to abstract. And you understand how things work at higher and higher levels. You give up on knowing some details that often don't matter depending on where you are. In fact, I apply that to programming and software development. High-level languages let you hide a lot of details that you shouldn't have to care about. It's no different.
Oh. So this is what the wisdom literature did too. It converted everything to psycho-spiritual meta-level explanations, and they didn't have to explain where the miracles came from, because that wasn't the point. No, we don't know.
Can we avoid the spiritual part there?
Sure. How about music as a way to transcend the different cultures and conversations? Like, were you able to use music to deal with people who weren't meta?
So, growing up, music was, and it probably still is, much more of an emotional thing than an intellectual pursuit. And in fact, that's why I gave it up the first time and went back to college, because it was so much on the emotional side, my intellectual curiosity wasn't being satisfied, and I got bored. And that's how I ended up. And then, of course, came back when the technology side of music started becoming a big thing. Did I answer your question?
So instead of making small talk, which you probably didn't want to do, were you able to sort of like do music and avoid the whole small talk thing? What I did is, the way to get invited to a lot of parties is I played a lot of instruments. And then I didn't have to engage in small talk at all.
Yep. I cannot tell you how many pianos I played at different parties, and then people would gather around and sing. And that happened even when I was grown up and working at IBM. There'd be things, events and stuff, and I would always end up playing the piano, and a whole bunch of people would be around singing. That happened all the time. I forgot about that.
In IBM and research, were there a lot of other musicians?
Define musician, because there's somebody who actually performs, and then there are a lot of people who know a lot about music but are listeners. And yeah, I mean, I'm in a place that's full of mathematicians and physicists and other scientists, and those things go together. Most people in that world are into music. They're not all good at it. Being a good composer, there's more to it than just understanding, here are the scales, here are the rules. There's an emotional side that I think has to come into play. And I think that's missing a lot of the time unless you've really lived in the music world.
So is intuition on the emotional side, or is also intuition on the intellectual side too?
I think intuition has a lot to do with internalizing stuff you've learned in the past. And then you get to a point where this feels like the right way, and maybe you make little mistakes and you adjust. But as opposed to planning everything out in advance, you sort of get a feel, this is the way to drive through the path, or this is the way to get from here to there, and you kind of feel your way, which is what I've done in most of my development career.
So does that imply if you have a lot of experience, it adds to your ability to intuit things?
Oh, I think so. I think the more you have done and the more you have internalized, if you will, the more you're able to make decisions. It's an abstraction again, as opposed to figuring everything out from first principles all the time. You don't, solve, a differential equation from first principles, but you learn the rules and you just do it. I think once you've gotten the experience, you're able to just basically, this is the way to do something, and it will work.
So let's think about that in music. Let's say a person wanted to become a good musician, and they cultivated this automated behavior, which they called a habit, because they did something a lot of times. And by automating it, they didn't have to think so much about it anymore. It became very natural. And by doing that a lot, although I don't necessarily subscribe to the 10,000-hour rule, but I think these automated behaviors do eventually add to your intuition.
Absolutely. They help. I think the one thing you have to be careful of, though, if you're trying to invent, sometimes you've got to get outside of those patterns and those things that you've always done and do it a bit differently. I remember reading, I think it was Keith Emerson, who's one of my music heroes, a phenomenal keyboard player and composer, and he commented once, when he writes, he doesn't sit at a piano because, when you sit down at the piano or you pick up your guitar or whatever it is, you tend to play familiar things. And so if you're away from your instrument, then you're not kind of locked into, this is what I've done before, let me just go play this riff or that riff. And you can kind of almost start with an empty slate and therefore be more creative. So there's room for both.
What if every time you play, you try to play things that you don't know? I'm a jazzer, as you know, so I'm improvising most of the time. So I'm constantly searching for things that might work and hardly ever playing things I know. In fact, I regard a composition as a point of departure, not as a point of arrival. You learn something and then you go, well, where can I go from here? And usually you get in trouble when you do that, but that's okay. I mean,
yeah, but jazz musicians turn that trouble into an opportunity. They'll play something, make a mistake, and then repeat it. It says, oh, I meant to do that, and go on. And some people will turn it into something very interesting. I'm no good at improvisation. For me, I have to work out the music in advance. I can do it by feel. I can jazz it around a little bit, but I don't really have a feel for just generalizing and just doing something out of the blue, no pun intended.
But you're an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurs do this. They do improvise because the original set of expectations they had tend to get violated, and then you find yourself trying to make sense of that mistake that you made.
Yeah, but that's adapting to change. You come up with an idea if you're working on a product, which I've done a few times, and then the world changes. It's like, oh, somebody else has done something similar, or you've got a beta group or some customers using an early thing, and they say, well, I'd really like to do this. And you suddenly realize, oh, I should have gone that way, not this way. And so I don't know if that's improvising or you're thinking about it carefully and planning, because improvising is not quite the same as planning. So I think those are different.
Well, I think venture capitalists, when they fund people, they tend to look for entrepreneurs who who will be flexible enough to recover after they mess up, because they're pretty sure that the entrepreneur is going to mess up and that that initial business plan is not going to be what happens. So they look for people who they think, they probably don't call it improvising, they might call it adapting or recovering. But I find as an entrepreneur and a jazzer it to be a sort of similar dance. It's just in jazz it's more real time. But,
yeah, I think having been through that world a few times myself, VCs and any kind of angel investor, private equity, they're often more interested in the person than the product to some extent, because they see things will probably change, and can this person deal with that? I think what they're looking for there is, do you have good judgment? Are you able to assess this happened, this happened, this happened, and that's going on there, and then can you make a decision taking all these things in and say, this is the way to go? They're looking for that kind of, which is a leadership.
Embedded within your answer, good judgment would include the ability to update your mental map and your model, because you're taking in new information
all the time,
and you're not being stubbornly
all the time. Without change, there's just stagnation. You've got to be able to change as new information comes in. Something you thought was true turns out not to be. You've got to be able to say, oh, I was wrong about that. And if you don't do that, you're stuck.
So this is why David is a creative outlier. Creative outliers have so many ideas that they don't get overly attached to the first few, and they come up with more. And a lot of the world cannot relate to people who do that because it's unnerving. A lot of the world thinks, here's the way it is, and it's going to continue to be that way. And then the creative outlier comes along and goes, oh, my model wasn't right, I'm going to change it, I'm going to do a different thing. We have a lot of political problems right now in the country over this very issue. Not everybody wants to change their model, and it's upsetting to them when people try to be, quote, progressive, which is scary to people who want to go backwards in time instead of forwards in time. But maybe I should stay away from that topic.
There's no end to that area.
Well,
I mean, the only thing I would say is, actually, I wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper that got published a few days ago on this very topic.
The Eagle? The Berkshire Eagle?
No, the Edge.
Oh, the Edge.
Yeah, it was in a couple of days ago. So if you go to a movie, and this is basically what I was writing about, if you go to a movie, and especially like a science fiction movie like Independence Day or some spy movie, you have to suspend your disbelief, and that's a well-known phrase. You know, if you're going to enjoy the movie, you can't keep dropping out and saying, well, that's ridiculous. You know, when they telnet a virus into the spaceship, or or they claim there's a deep state, in an action movie, and somebody jumps off of buildings and lands perfectly fine. You have to suspend your disbelief, or you're not going to enjoy the movie. But too many people suspend their disbelief in real life. I think that's a huge problem. You hear something or you read something, and certain news outlets are very good at this. They'll put something with a question mark, so they're never actually saying something, but they leave people believing absurd things, and nobody stops to say, well, wait a minute, does this make sense? So they're not suspending. They're in this disbelief mode, and they keep that, and so they'll just accept stuff which doesn't make any sense.
So it becomes performative instead of rational.
And it drives decision making, and you end up with bizarre environmental situations that you can't even have a discussion because people don't have the same basis. I don't mind having a discussion about how to solve a particular problem. Climate change is a perfect example, and people can discuss, well, if we do this, we're going to get rid of all the jobs, and what will happen, or we do this, blah, 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 blah. And yeah, that's true. You have to just figure out how you're going to do it and find a compromise. But if you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in climate change, you can't even get started because you don't have any common ground. And we have a huge problem with people not accepting and recognizing basically basic underlying facts that are demonstrable. And it's a huge problem.
So let's take that into the world of science and research.
Yep.
Because if you come up with a new idea in science and research and people assume that that's not the way it is, so here's for example, and I'm sure you can give IBM examples. When I was at Bose, they only used operational amplifiers. There's nothing digital. And when I started designing digital filters, people said, why would we need digital filters? I said, because audio is going to become digital. And they went, no way. We could do anything we need to do with an op amp. And I said, then why did you hire somebody with a graduate degree in digital signal processing? I said, oh, because you were a good speaker designer. You must have run into stuff like this at IBM too. What happens when you get really smart people who are really attached to their ideas? It's not only political, it's also in science too.
I think it happens everywhere. But the whole point of the scientific method is to basically eliminate the human opinion part and basically say, okay, here's my idea. Here are the tests that you can apply to figure out, is this idea right? Is it right to our current level of understanding? You know, things can change. You know, go from people thought heavier things fell faster to things fall at the same time to, you know, relativity where, you know, mass isn't constant, you know, and at different times we had different beliefs, so we accepted things. New data comes along, say, oh, that fails the test. My original idea is wrong or has to be adjusted. And the whole point of the scientific method is to basically try and eliminate, and it can take a while because people are stubborn, but to try and eliminate the subjective piece of it and basically say, here's the data, here's the test, here's the phenomena that we're seeing, here's an idea for how that works, and here's a way we can test it. And if we're right, this theory works so far. If we're not right, you throw the theory out. It's easy to prove something wrong. You just need a single counterexample. The thing is, of course, what you see all the time is, especially if you've ever had a discussion with a conspiracy theorist, you prove something wrong, and they immediately move on to the next point. And that just goes on and on forever. Eventually, they just start the ad hominem attacks and insult the person talking because they've run out.
Okay, so for those of you who are trying to hang on to the music thread, which we didn't get to yet, I need to point out that David managed to include Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein in the same sentence, because that's a real demonstration of operating at a meta level. And then he cascaded onto several more universes all at the same time, which are all correct. But I'm not sure that the whole world will get it. So let's talk about music a little bit.
All right.
And so the classical musicians, they don't improvise. The jazz musicians, they a lot of times don't even know how to read music. The rock musicians, sometimes they compose really, really complicated things, which they may or may not write down in notation. They may record it or capture it some other way. You've been a composer, you've written music, you've also toured. How much of this stuff is written down? Or is it not written down on paper, but electromagnetically stored or digitally stored? What's the lingua franca for you conveying your music?
So that's a very good question. The way I tend to work with, and I've played in several tribute bands, so the music has already been written and performed. Whether it was ever actually written down in standard music notation, I don't know. A lot of it they just recorded. What I often do, because I have to think about the sounds as well as the notes, which is another big difference when you play synthesizers in that world, I will actually get a transcription of the piece of music so that I can look and say, that's what they're playing, and then I can focus on how am I going to put this together with the right sounds and have it in the right places on my keyboards to actually perform it. So I'm thinking a lot about how do I play this stuff. And as far as I'm concerned, if it's recorded, that's just a different way of being written down. And I can get back the written down if I want it.
So since we only have around a minute left, I want to use this as an excuse for you to talk about the software that you've created to help manage this process, which a minute I know is not enough time, but you've just described a lot of complexity and it needs managing. And people cannot just worry about what the notes are. They have to worry about what the sounds are.
Yeah.
And there's an infinite set of sounds, and they're also all happening at the same time. So what did I know you can't say much, but we can go over by a little.
Yeah. So I was touring, and I was using software products that were out there, and they didn't quite work for me. They didn't do everything I needed, and I had a development partner at the time, and he was a guitarist, also toured, and none of them really worked. And we decided, let's build our own. And the focus was on, let's separate what a musician does from what a recording engineer does. So what has happened with modern DAWs, digital audio workstations, is people build the entire song inside this DAW. So they'll perform it, they'll create the sound, they'll do all the manipulation. Our position is, no, I'm a musician, I perform, I play on an instrument, maybe synthesizers, I'm creating sounds, and I need to manage all those sounds. And then over there is the recording, and I'll play with all my sounds, you record it, and maybe you'll mix it and tweak it, but I've made the sound. And so we built a system aimed at musicians who you don't need to have a PhD in audio engineering. You basically say, I want to connect this sound to that, I want to process this way, and you just visually connect them together, and you start basically playing your instrument. And we don't focus at all on the recording and engineering side. So it's much more how a musician thinks as opposed to the more logical way that an audio engineer is thinking in terms of capturing everything into channel strips and so on. So it's a very different approach that works very well for musicians.
I think we could do a whole program on this, but I think we're out of time. So I'm not even going to ask the other 30 questions about this. So I think that's it for the moment. By the way, David does actually have a PhD in computer science besides being a touring musician. And so he knows both ends of the spectrum. And that's it for now, but we'll be back. So Nina, you're the only person I know who ever started a museum, and a streaming museum. And we're not going to start with that. We're going to get to what is a streaming museum, and then where does a streaming museum allow you to go to from there. So I want to start with the fact that everyone who's been on this program, which is called Harvesting Infinity, is what I would consider a creative outlier. And you're clearly a creative outlier. In fact, I'd go further than that. You're a creative outlier who managed to turn into an innovator. You didn't only have insights, you actually applied them and got them adopted, and other people got on board. So your insights are actually in motion in the world doing stuff. So that's even better than being a creative outlier. Creative outliers have insight, but you actually did it. So I'm kind of curious, in how did you get from a little girl who wanted to be a dancer and then became a piano player, but you ended up creating a museum, and somehow along the way becoming like an art curator in between? So how did that happen?
Oh my God, how did that happen? Well, as a little girl, I was studying piano, even though I really wanted to study dance, but my family guided me into the piano direction. So my mother used to sit with me. She would come to every piano lesson and listen, and she was so encouraging. And she would say, like, when I'm playing, make the people feel the emotion of what you're playing. So then I went off to high school, and I was a very quiet little girl. And it was a Catholic school. It was Maria Regina High School. And the head of the music department was so supportive of me. I mean, she really gave me a lot of confidence. She made me the director of the pianist for the choir. She gave me an opportunity to compose a piece for the choir, which was amazing. And then she helped me get into college, Marymount College, where I majored in piano with Seymour Lipkin, but we had to take courses in all different fields. But I will go back and say regarding family, I come from an Italian family, and so every Sunday after church, the family on my father's side would have to get together for a big dinner at my grandmother's house. And
Was music
so,
ever part of those dinners?
yes, there were musicians and dancers from different parts of the world because my Uncle Natale Colosi, um, he was a Renaissance man, and he was a scientist, a politician, a head of a hospital, uh, microbiologist. I mean, he was amazing. And even though he was kind of an Italian man where the woman has her place in the world, I was completely inspired at these dinners every Sunday by the people he would bring together, opera singers, people who were, immigrants trying to make it in New York, that he would help them, politicians, people from different parts of the world. There was a doctor from Puerto Rico who used to dance the dances of Puerto Rico. There was pianists. I think that I was very sold on going into the field of, learning to play the piano when there was a pianist friend of my uncle's who played on the piano, and it completely blew me away. His fingers were moving so fast, and had such energy that I said, "This is what I'm going to do.
So
Forget
how
dance.
old were
I'm going
you?
to do this."
How old
Oh
were you when
God,
you started happening? You were born into this.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, these dinners, these kind of multidisciplinary international dinners every single Sunday really influenced my entire path. And it went into my subconscious. I wasn't thinking, I'm going to be a politician or a scientist, although I did want to become a scientist. It's just what goes into your subconscious. And my mother was very encouraging. My father was an artist and also a musician. He was a drummer. He had a band. He was an engineer. So that's kind of the
Wow.
launch pad. The launch pad, yeah.
That's a pretty unusual family. And you were immersed in culture as a participant. I was immersed in culture as an observer. My parents overexposed me to the arts and culture, and they took me to a million places, but
Yes.
they didn't do these things. We just went to these things. But your family did them and invited guests into the house to do them. So that's very and it was a big family, so there was a lot of activity.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was hearing politics, of the day and just everything, a real mix. And so that is what Streaming Museum is. It's a worldview. Okay. It's a mix of all of these feels and art, music, what's going on in the world. Yeah, there it
So
is.
so you have been considering yourself to be a citizen of the world, a cultured citizen of the world from the very beginning. You grew
Yeah,
up
5
feeling
years old, 4 years old, whatever.
so
Yeah.
you didn't become a citizen of the world later. You started out as a citizen of
Uh-huh.
the world.
Yeah, little did I know. Yeah.
So did your Renaissance man uncle smoke a big cigar?
No.
Just trying to paint the image of the family. And when your mother said, "So play so people feel it," but she didn't play an instrument.
No, she played a little bit of piano, but she was an artist. And I have a lot of her art here. And my father was an artist. And I'm thinking of taking their art, and because I'm making videos now, to include their art in these videos that go with my music that I'm composing.
Wow, so that's really fascinating. So the piano, I guess, is kind of a universal cultural thing for families, especially at that point in time. A lot of families had a piano, not a stereo, and
Right.
a lot of the music that was shared revolved around people being in the room with the piano.
Right. And singing together.
Hmm.
Did you see that there's a message that
I
the
did.
Zoom is going to end?
I did. Okay, so now we know where we are. We're halfway there.
Okay.
So now I'm getting even more clear about this.
Okay.
You grew up in an internationally oriented family that was also a tight nuclear family, and everybody was supportive of creativity and the arts and the culture. And since it seems like everybody in the family was artistic, it was very natural for you to move in the direction of not only art, but the arts, all of them.
Hmm.
And you never stopped. From
Right.
from 5 years old all the way through, you continued to be multicultural, global, expressive.
Hmm.
So you grew up in an expression salon.
Oh,
Okay, so tell us now what is the streaming museum and how does this feed into that? Well, why did you make a streaming museum anyway? Did you think there was a need for one, or did you just find yourself doing it?
okay. Let me think now. Um, after I started reinventing myself, after I moved from Westport to New York City, and I started meeting people, uh, I met a pioneer digital artist that I had read about, and I contacted him, and we had a discussion. And because I had an electronic music studio in Westport, when I had my kids and so on. So I had this connection. I thought, hey, digital art, digital music. So one thing led to another. He introduced me to some people in New York, and I introduced him to a Russian woman artist that I knew. And it all kind of blossomed from there because the Russian woman, Anna Rushagova, and this is all on my website, this whole story, she invited me to bring digital art to Moscow in 1999 and then again in 2001. So then the digital artist introduced me to some people in New York at School of Visual Arts. And because I had done this exciting thing in Russia, it had this aura. And so it sounded like, see this?
Mhm.
This
New
was
York
the
Digital
10th,
Salon.
right, the 10th anniversary New York Digital Salon. They brought me in to create a publication for the 10th anniversary. And what I did is I invited 10 of the top international curators to each select 10 of the top digital artists in 2001. And it
So,
was at the time when San Francisco MoMA had their big digital art. Digital art was really getting strong back then. It was really emerging.
so
And
I just want you to
yeah,
say what your website is because there's so much
oh yeah,
information and you have so many of these things online that
right.
so it's the streaming museum,
The address is streamingmuseum.org. Yeah,
streamingmuseum.org.
.org. Right,
And
right.
that has some of this background and piece.
Everything is there since 2001. Um,
Everybody go there to the streaming museum.
I'll show you the website. Just want to say one thing. After I did this School of Visual Arts thing, I was, in demand for some reason. Here I was just like a musician, and then I kind of fell into digital arts. So then I was hired by Chelsea Art Museum in 2003 and I started the project room for new media and performing arts. And everything took off from there. In 2004, I had a reception for the first internet public artwork by Jean Gau called People's Portrait, which was that he set up kiosks in several cities around the world, including Times Square, and people would take their picture, it would go into the database and circulate around the world. And that was the inspiration, that was the aha moment for Streaming Museum in 2004. It's all on the website. So I had the reception for him at Chelsea Art Museum. And so that's when I got the idea for Stream Museum. And yeah.
How long did it take after you had this idea to have a first version of a streaming museum up?
4 years, 2008. 2008 was the cusp of the expansion of the internet, screen culture, mobile, all of that. Like it really exploded back then. And so I wanted to take advantage of that and connect the world through art. And I showed the first piece was Good Morning, Mr. Orwell by Nam June Paik, because that was the first satellite international artwork. So, and
So
I'm yeah.
you started doing this, there wasn't very much online, and then there became more bandwidth. So did this start as single art and become like film or moving art?
Oh yeah, it was mostly what I did is maybe I should put up the website quick because there's that 30-second thing.
Well, what
We have
I'm
time.
wondering
We
is
only have 3
something,
minutes.
yeah, something just flashed on the screen. So yeah, let's put it up and use it to take it out. This is an infinite world, the streaming museum. So this is just a peek into an on-ramp to it. So yeah, share us that on-ramp.
Okay, wait a minute.
So you can see how this was a very natural thing for Nina to do. She was already there before she started. It almost feels like an
That's a good way
inevitable
to
thing.
say it. Yeah. Wait, sorry.
That's okay. I think we may be just about out of time. So
Here we go. Do you see it?
I see it.
Okay, that's the home page of the website, which has a link to a show I just did at Lincoln Center. I composed music for it. This is a series of stories. I had a grant from the Puffin Foundation to write about. It was about the next Renaissance and the environment. So there are a lot of 45 artists, including you, Howard, and an essay I wrote about you. Lots
Oh,
of music and art around the world. And this is, oops, these are some of the locations around the world, some of the events at the UN, Bucharest, Milan, Macau, Antarctica, Johannesburg, Sao Paulo, Umea, Melbourne, Times Square. You know, we've done big projects across Times Square, a few of them, in artist
wow.
studios, talks with different artists, music on the street, which I love, covering world issues. This is the launch of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, and you can read about the publication that I co-produced about the 75th anniversary of the UN. It's all online.
This is totally amazing. And I'm not sure exactly how much time we have left because there's no timer was set. So I'm assuming that we're probably at the end of our segment because I couldn't tell. But for everybody who wants to see more of this, go to streamingmuseum.org and you can see what Nina has cooked up. I guess it's the first streaming museum. Do you think there'll be more streaming museums?
It is going to evolve now into more of my music with these artists and topics that I have covered over the past many, many years.